Hello, everyone. This is going to be a very brief and very general overview of the Haudenosaunee involvement in the American Revolutionary War. They're also often referred to as the Iroquois, but that's actually an exonym applied by the French to the Haudenosaunee. The word Haudenosaunee means people of the Longhouse. I don't remember what Iroquois means, but I I think it was a French corruption of a Huron Wyandot word for the Haudenosaunee, which meant strangers or neighbors. Anyway, oh, that's the Haudenosaunee flag at the top of the screen right there. The four squares represent four of the tribes, while the tree-like insignia in the middle represents one of the fifth tribe. Of course, this was the flag used before the introduction of the sixth tribe, because by the end of the American Revolutionary War, there would be six Haudenosaunee tribes. Actually, this is a good segue into that part of their history right here. The Haudenosaunee were a confederacy of originally five nominally, virtually independent tribes living in what is now upstate New York, stretching from the Hudson River Valley all the way to the Great Lakes. A sixth tribe would be added in 1722, the Tuscarora. So the first five were the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca. And the sixth would be the Tuscarora. They were a pretty important power player in what is now the northeastern United States, from the arrival of the French all the way to the rise of the United States of America. However, the American Revolutionary War would really prove to be the breaking point for the Confederacy. Now, at the time of the start of hostilities between the British Crown and the American colonists, there were three principal Haudenosaunee military leaders. There was Joseph Brant, who was a Mohawk, and then there was Corn Planter and Chainbreaker, known to the white colonists and as Governor Blacksnake, who were both Seneca. Brant was the most visible and therefore the most influential of these Haudenosaunee military leaders. He was the one that interacted the most with the British and the American colonists. He was very much anglicized. He had an English name, he knew the English language, and he adopted English customs and clothing. All of the influential Haudenosaunee war chiefs did this to some extent, but not as much as Joseph Brant. Now, at the start of the Revolutionary War, the Iroquois were courted by British and colonial diplomats. For the colonists, there was a congregational reverend by the name of Samuel Kirkland, while the British had an Irish diplomat by the name of Guy Johnson and his cousin John Johnson. Ultimately, four of the Haudenosaunee tribes allied with the British: the Mohawk, the Seneca, the Onondaga, and the Cayuga. However, two of them allied with the American colonists, the Oneida and the Tuscarora. Now, Haudenosaunee, at first, they did not want to get involved in this war because they saw it as a dispute between white men. But their eventual involvement in the war was inevitable for two important reasons. The first one was simple proximity. They were residing in upstate New York. They were sandwiched between the 13 colonies and British Canada. They were right there. They were the colonists were right next door. Fighting was going to erupt in New York sooner or later, and it would be inevitable that the Haudenosaunee would be dragged into the war. They would also be dragged into the war because of trade. Trade was the lifeblood of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy by the time of the American Revolution. By the 1770s, the Haudenosaunee were actually very much dependent on European or colonial-made goods, such as clothing, metalware like pots and pans, and firearms. Firearms would, whether the Haudenosaunee liked it or not, be very much integrated in their society. They would not only be heavily used in warfare, but in subsistence hunting as well. And so, to continue the supply of these these important trade goods for the Haudenosaunee, they had to get involved in the war. There was also the this sense of kinship, of bonding between the Haudenosaunee and the British, or the colonists, and this back and forth trade relationship strengthening that friendship and that bond. And so the Haudenosaunee, no matter which tribe they lived in, they felt an obligation to come to the aid of these British. However, the conflict complicated things for the Haudenosaunee because they just saw all the English as, English. Of course, they were the French, but they had long since stepped out. They had for 10 years stepped out because of the British victory in the 7 Years' War. And so the Haudenosaunee had to deal with the British, and they saw all the British as the same. They didn't matter if the British man was from England or was born and raised in the colonies here. They were all the same. They all had the same skin color. They all spoke the same language. When the conflict between the royal government and the colonists erupted, this deeply divided the Haudenosaunee as to who they should support. Because there was debates among them like, should they support the British government? While they were the stronger faction, while they were more organized than the colonists, they were 3,000 miles away in another continent. How could they possibly enforce any sort of law, let alone any agreements the Haudenosaunee wanted, when they're so far away? And the colonists are right here. The Haudenosaunee deal with the colonists far more often than the royal government in London. They have bonds with them as well. So this war, from the outset, really divided Haudenosaunee society. And battle lines were drawn, whether the Haudenosaunee liked it or not, between themselves, as much as between the royal government and the colonists. Now, Haudenosaunee society would start to break apart really at the Battle of Oriskany on August 6, 1777. This is a battle where loyalist militias, greatly aided by Haudenosaunee forces such as the Mohawk and I think the Seneca, they ambushed a group of colonial militia. The Haudenosaunee called the battlefield a place of great sadness, because this was one of the first times that Haudenosaunee fought Haudenosaunee. Because a contingent of Oneida warriors fought with the colonists. And this would prove to be one of the breaking points of the Confederacy, or at least the Confederacy's unity as a single coherent political unit. And things would get worse for the Haudenosaunee with the Cherry Valley Massacre on November 11th, 1778. So far throughout the Revolutionary War, the action in New York's frontier between the colonists and the Haudenosaunee was largely restricted to raiding, like mutual raids. The occasional battle such as Oriskany was relatively rare, but it did happen. Another battle occurred before Cherry Valley, the Battle of Wyoming, where hundreds of patriots were killed. But Cherry Valley is the one that stuck with the minds of the colonists, where 30 colonial civilians were killed by a mixed force of loyalist and Mohawk and Seneca soldiers, led by this British officer named William Butler. And Butler claimed that he had no control over the Native Americans. And it was also further claimed that Joseph Brant was present at Cherry Valley and allowed the massacre to happen, and even ordered the massacre to happen. Now, Brant wasn't actually there. Factually, he wasn't there. But the rumors persisted, and there was a great deal of anger among the Americans and among the nascent American government. And it was generally agreed that something had to be done. And so George Washington dispatched one of his generals, a John Sullivan, to execute an attack on Haudenosaunee territory, partly as a reciprocation for Cherry Valley, and partly just to knock the Haudenosaunee out of the war. This was called the Sullivan Expedition. It lasted from June to October of 1779. It was a great success for the Americans. I think around 40 Haudenosaunee towns were destroyed in this military campaign. What's worse, the farmlands were burned and the grain stores were burned, which meant that by the time winter rolled around in December, the Haudenosaunee would have virtually no food. All their stores of grain, like of maize and squash and beans, it would have been totally destroyed. And all the people in what remained of those towns, they would starve in the winter. This was devastating for the Haudenosaunee. The civilians of those burned towns, they had to flee. They were refugees. They had to flee to British Canada, especially to Fort Niagara. And this was a massive crisis point for the Haudenosaunee, and this broke their military power. The devastation was so absolute, so complete, that the Haudenosaunee nicknamed George Washington Town Destroyer. And after this expedition, the Haudenosaunee ceased to be a massive military threat like they were once before, especially at Oriskany, Wyoming, or Cherry Valley. And so the siege of Yorktown rolled around, and the British were decisively defeated there. And 2 years later, there was the Treaty of Paris. Now, interesting note, in the peace negotiations of 1782 and 83, Native Americans, especially the Haudenosaunee, were not represented at all at these negotiations. They were a non-entity. And so by the conclusion of the Treaty of Paris, where the British virtually ceded all the territory between the Mississippi River and the 13 colonies, the Native Americans were not represented at all. Their interests were not visible at all in Paris. Of course, this was for racial reasons. The British did not treat the Native Americans nearly the same way as they treated the American colonists. No European power did. And so, as a result, the Native Americans living in all that territory, especially the Haudenosaunee in upstate New York or northern Pennsylvania, they were left to the mercy of the United States government. And so the United States decided to enforce its sovereignty on these areas. Gradually, not all of it happened in the immediate years after the Revolutionary War, but ultimately the United States did exert its sovereignty over these territories. First and foremost in upstate New York, with the Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1784. Now, the Americans did allow small parcels of land to be allocated to the Haudenosaunee, but largely the Haudenosaunee were forced to give up almost all their ancestral land in upstate New York. Military resistance was not really a viable option for them because most of their civilian population had fled to Forts Niagara and Ontario and British Canada. Their populations were depleted because of disease, combat, starvation, exposure. Many of their warriors were killed in battle over the course of the war, and so they just didn't have the strength anymore to resist the United States, especially a nascent United States, which still had a fairly powerful standing army, fairly well trained. However, this didn't cause the extinction of the Haudenosaunee people. There are still Native Americans in the United States today that self-identify as one of the Haudenosaunee tribes. And the most visible would be the Mohawk, or the Seneca, or the Oneida. And they still exist in upstate New York. There are still communities of all 6 tribes in upstate New York. I think one of them owns a casino there, too. I think it was the Mohawk who owned a casino. Yeah, I think so. But yeah, while the American Revolution didn't drive them to extinction, it did greatly reduce them in power to an almost negligible status. Now, these are the 3 books I used as information, like sources for information. The Iroquois and the American Revolution by Barbara Graymont, Forgotten Allies, the Oneida Indians and the American Revolution by Joseph T. Gladhar, and James Kirby Martin, and The American Revolution in Indian Country, Crisis and Diversity in Native American Communities by Colin G. Calloway. I actually tended to rely more on Barbara Graymon's book than the other two, and I did feel like they were being quite generous to the Haudenosaunee, because from what I can personally infer, and from what I've seen from other sources, the Haudenosaunee, after the Sullivan expedition, were greatly reduced in strength. Well, all these three books claim that they still managed to keep up a high degree a strong degree rather of military expeditions into the New York frontier after the Sullivan expedition. Something in which I personally, I struggle to see that because of the expedition's great devastation of the Haudenosaunee lands. But I would suggest that one should read any three of these books, or maybe even all three of these books, and form their own conclusions on whether the Haudenosaunee truly managed to remain a force in the American Revolution after the Sullivan expedition in '79. Ultimately, I feel that the Haudenosaunee were just one of the first of Native American nation, one of the first of the Native American nations to succumb to the military might of the United States of America. And they were just the first in a very long and very bloody road that the United States walked on. But they survived to this day. Thank you for watching.